Good evening, everyone. It's great to see everyone there. 67, I think that's 10 more than we had last time. And last time was 2 more than we had before. Paul's our math guy, so he can tell you that that's going in the right direction, I think. Before we begin, there are just a couple of little announcements that I'm going to make. I won't take a long time. One is Paul, who's our membership manager on the whole for the Kingston Historical Society. He informs me that we have 17 guests tonight, and I want to welcome those guests. The others are presumably our members. So welcome, and Paul, never missing a beat, says make sure you let the guests know that if they choose freely on their own, they may become members. All you have to do is go to our website, and Paul will be happy to help you out. Okay, the other thing, and this is really quite interesting, I think, John Town, who is a member and is very involved with the Canadian Club of Kingston, wanted us to make a little announcement that this Thursday on March the 11th, next Thursday, sorry, March the 11th, Dr. Paul Robinson, who's a prof at Ottawa U, will be speaking at the Canadian Club. It's going to be a virtual forum, but it's their regular meeting. There's a picture of him. It's a low-tech way of showing pictures. And if you are interested in this at all, I'm certainly interested in it. He's going to be speaking on the world in Moscow's eyes. How do Russians see the world and the West? So 100 years after full-bore Russian Revolution, we're still trying to figure out Russia, and they're trying to figure us out as well. I think it'll be a very fascinating talk. Paul told me that if we go on the Historical Society website on Friday, I think Paul, is it on Friday? Yeah. Okay, so on Friday, he will have full details of this up there for you to see. I don't think there's anything else that I need to say. I'm Vincent Duran, president of the Kingston Historical Society, and I just once again want to welcome everyone. I'm going to turn it over now to Duncan McDowell, and Duncan is the head of our programming committee and the MC for this evening. So take it away, Duncan.
Thank you, Vincent. Welcome, everyone. Pleasure to be here. It's also my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Marc Seguin, who joins us from his home in Prince Edward County. In recent decades, we have tended in Kingston to fall into the habit of thinking of our town as a university town, as a military town, a civil service town, a limestone city. Identities, all of which are rooted in terra firma. But we, at the same time, have largely fallen out of the habit of thinking of our city as a port. Yes, the occasional small cruise ship drops anchor in our harbor, and the Wolf Island ferry comes and goes. But the freighters are gone, and the grain elevators are gone, and the coal piles along the shore are all gone. But 100 years ago, we would have thought of our city as a port that sustained our livelihood as an urban center. In the 19th century, our docks thrived on forwarding commodities, timber, potash, wheat, up the St. Lawrence to export markets that built our economy. At the same time, thousands of immigrants came up the St. Lawrence and landed on our docks to begin their Canadian life. Ships were built here. Naval battles took place off our shores. But getting to Kingston by sea was no easy matter. Shoals, vicious late fall storms, and the currents of the St. Lawrence all made navigation difficult. Lost at sea became a familiar epithet in Kingston cemeteries. And it was the challenge of minimizing the dangers of sailing on the Great Lakes that has fascinated Marc Seguin as a historian. Marc has deep Franco-Ontarian roots that go back to the late 18th century in Essex County. After studying history at the University of Western Ontario, Marc lived in the Toronto area and then sensibly moved to Prince Edward County. There he has devoted himself to local history, helping to establish a lighthouse preservation society, Save Our Lighthouses, and running his own press, the Ontario History Press. In doing so, he has authored 2 books, one which he will focus on tonight, studying the lighthouses along the coast of what he calls the graveyard of Lake Ontario. Another book draws very interestingly on the journal account of a Victorian soldier in Upper Canada sailing on the lake in the good ship Breeze. It is therefore wonderful to encounter such industry and imagination in a local historian. So without further ado, I invite Mark to shed light, if you'll allow me to adopt a lighthouse metaphor, on the graveyard of Lake Ontario. Welcome, Mark.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. I'm sorry, Duncan, thank you very much. Let me see if I can get this system started here. Okay, can you just give me a clue about what you're seeing there? Make sure you're seeing what you expect, what I expect.
Only seeing you so far, Mark. It's still just normal video. It hasn't shared the screen yet, or it's not the right screen.
Okay. Share screen.
You have a picture of a lighthouse behind you, if that's what you're looking for.
There we go.
That's it. See the lighthouse now.
Okay, how about now? What do you see now?
We're seeing your slide now. Just the
Okay,
slide.
great. Well, again, thanks, and good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here tonight as part of your Kingston Historical Society Speakers Series. As the title here promises, tonight I'll be talking about Kingston's lighthouses, perhaps not as eloquently as Duncan introduced, but I'll give it my best shot. But I bet some of you are thinking, well, really, how much is there to talk about? Surely there weren't that many lighthouses in Kingston at any point. But really, what I'm generally going to be talking about is more than 45 lighthouses and light towers that were built on the Canadian side of Eastern Lake Ontario in the 19th century and into the 20th century, and all of which combined to contribute directly to the growth and prosperity of Kingston and to Canada. And many of these lighthouses were built specifically to guide ships to Kingston through a very hazardous portion of the lake that became known as the graveyard of Lake Ontario. Now, in particular, I will focus on some of those iconic aids to navigation that were built in the immediate vicinity of Kingston Harbor, here at the far edge of these dangerous waters. Now, this is really a story about expanding settlement in the Great Lakes region in the 19th century. This time period saw populations increase 50-fold from 200,000 people to 10 million over the course of just 80 years. And this is a story about the transportation systems needed to support that settlement, because transportation really was the key to economic development of the interior of North America, and the wilderness made overland travel along poorly maintained roads nearly impossible. So for most of the 19th century, bateaux and barques, barges and brigs, sloops and schooners and steamboats were absolutely essential for the transportation of goods and passengers through the Rideau Canal, up and down the St. Lawrence River, and across all of the Great Lakes. During this century, the number of ships carrying cargoes and passengers on the Great Lakes increased from less than 50 to more than 4,000. And Kingston grew into one of the 19th century's most important Great Lakes ports. This was the primary transshipment point for goods moving between the Atlantic Ocean and the interior of the continent, and it was a major shipbuilding center. Here's a comment made by Robert Gourlay in his book in 1822. The harbor is formed by a bay stretching up northerly from the front of the town. The west shore is suitable for wharves, of which there are already as many as 10, where vessels of any burden may lie in safety and load and unload when convenience and ease. From its situation, it is the natural depot of those articles of commerce which are transported over the lakes in vessels and up and down the river in boats. Here they meet and deposit and exchange their cargoes. Later in the 19th century, Sir Richard Bonnycastle wrote, "There are 10 daily first-class steamers running to and from Kingston, and about 30 smaller steamers and propellers, with a fleet of 200 schooners and sailing barges. This rising city now containing near 12,000 inhabitants. Kingston is, in fact, the key of the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence and the Rideau Canal being their outlets for commerce." By the middle of the 19th century, well-established shipping routes were being used to sail between Kingston and all of the major ports on the Great Lakes and out to the Atlantic Ocean. I've taken this 1838 map of Upper Canada and overlaid the main shipping routes in red, all of which converge on Kingston. But the waters of Lake Ontario in the approaches to Kingston were some of the most treacherous on all of the Great Lakes. This is a portion of the first comprehensive nautical chart of Lake Ontario, produced by Augustus Ford of the US Navy in 1836. Again, the red lines have been added to indicate the primary shipping routes. And there were so many shipwrecks and ship sinkings in this northeastern quadrant of the lake that much of it became known as the graveyard of Lake Ontario. Let me just take a few minutes now to read you a very short passage from my book, For Want of a Lighthouse, to give you a better understanding of why this area of the Great Lakes was so dangerous. For most of its length and breadth, the deep open waters of Lake Ontario were easily navigated by sailing ships, steamboats, and steamships. However, from Presqu'île Point near Brighton, Ontario, to the entrance of the St. Lawrence River at Kingston, the northeastern quadrant of the lake has always presented numerous hazards to mariners. This 65 nautical mile stretch is dominated by the irregular-shaped peninsula of Prince Edward County, which protrudes out into Lake Ontario from the Canadian shore like a giant, misshapen anvil awaiting the hammer blows of fierce storms to smite ships against its rocky reefs and sandy shoals. For much of the 19th century, ship captains had no choice but to navigate around this protruding landmass, and as there were no sheltered harbors along its Lake Ontario shore, they were forced to sail much of the distance knowing that there would be no refuge should a storm suddenly develop. A number of geographical, geological, hydrographical, and meteorological factors converge in this quadrant of the lake to compound the dangers presented by the protruding Prince Edward Peninsula, one of which is a line of shoals, reefs, and rocky islands reaching right across Lake Ontario from Prince Edward County's southeastern point to the shores of New York State, forming a further series of obstacles to ships sailing to and from Kingston and the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. Along this line, known by hydrographers as the Duck-Galoo Ridge, the otherwise deep lake suddenly becomes shallower and narrower, thereby magnifying the effects of storms, which resulted in such a large number of ship sinkings and shipwrecks in the 19th century that this area became known as, yes, that's right, the graveyard of Lake Ontario. Well, the same Prince Edward Peninsula also has a calmer, gentler side in the form of a sheltered inside passage along its northern and eastern edge, where there are dozens of safe harbors. This inside passage is centered on the relatively smooth waters of the Bay of Quinte, a wide meandering waterway providing more than 40 nautical miles of generally easy sailing. With the opening of the Murray Canal in 1890, a complete waterway connection from the Bay of Quinte to the open lake was established. With the absence of passable roads in early Upper Canada, it was the lakes and rivers of the interior of the country, especially the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River, that were the most practical transportation routes available. As the 19th century progressed, more ships carried more cargo and more passengers to more ports, and the want of lighthouses on the Great Lakes was increasingly felt. Ship captains and ship owners demanded that more and more lighthouses be built, especially in the northeast quadrant of Lake Ontario, where the numerous navigational hazards coincided with some of the busiest shipping routes. In response to these demands, a remarkable network of lighthouses developed along the Canadian shores of eastern Lake Ontario. By the early 20th century, a total of more than 45 lighthouses and light towers had been erected along this 65 nautical mile stretch over the course of some 85 years, resulting in one of the greatest concentrations of lighthouses anywhere in the world. Now, there's no doubt that one way or another, all of these lighthouses contributed to the growth of Kingston in the 19th century as one of the most important ports on the Great Lakes. But I'm only going to talk about a few of these lighthouses, specifically the ones that were built in the immediate vicinity of Kingston Harbor. To learn more about the others, my book, For Want of a Lighthouse, is available online, or it can be ordered from the Novel Idea on Princess Street in Kingston. The nautical chart that I'm showing here is one that was originally developed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in 1877. I just want to reorient you by flipping this chart around so that we're seeing Lake Ontario as if we're looking at it from Kingston. And I'll zoom in here to the area that we'll be focusing on. In fact, let me replace this chart with an aerial view. Here we go. So with this aerial view, we're looking toward the southwest as if we're in an airplane flying at like 20,000 feet. And we can see all the way from Kingston to Main Duck Island and the shores of Prince Edward County. The red lines, again, are marking the standard 19th century shipping lanes in the approaches to Kingston, many of them, of course, passing through the very dangerous waters. And the red dots here represent a small number of the lighthouses which were built at various times to help guide ships to and from Kingston. And I'll just zoom in a bit more here. These are the specific lighthouses in the immediate vicinity of Kingston that I'll talk about in more detail. So now that we have a bit of the background, let's start with the earliest of the Kingston area lighthouses, the 9 Mile Point Lighthouse. This is one of Canada's most historic lighthouses. It was activated in 1833 and is Canada's oldest active Great Lakes lighthouse. Almost exactly 30 years earlier, in 1803, the legislature of Upper Canada had recognized that aids to navigation on Lake Ontario were essential for the province's vital marine commerce. So an act was passed authorizing the construction of 3 lighthouses on the lake. They were to be located at Mississauga Point, which is at the mouth of the Niagara River, at Gibraltar Point, which is the entrance to the harbor at York, now Toronto, and at 9 Mile Point on Simcoe Island, at the western entrance to Kingston Harbor. Well, the Mississauga Point Lighthouse was built in 1804, although it was demolished during the War of 1812. And the Gibraltar Point Lighthouse at York was in operation by 1808, and in fact, it's still standing, but it's no longer in service. As for the 9 Mile Point Lighthouse, well, it appears that the province ran out of money before it could be built. So for the next 3 decades, there were no more lighthouses built on the Canadian side of Lake Ontario. In the meantime, there were many newspaper reports like this one in the Kingston Chronicle of 1822. On the morning of Sunday, the 17th of November, the schooner Hibernia of this port, bound with a valuable cargo of goods to York, ran upon the false ducks in a fog and was wrecked. The crew, who are saved, managed to get all the goods, with the exception of some casks of sugar, landed on the beach, but more or less damaged by the water. In attempting to bring away the cargo, 2 boats, one belonging to the dockyard, the other a Durham boat, have also been unfortunately lost. In consequence of the exposed situation of the wreck and the stormy weather lately experienced, the vessel, we understand, is gradually going to pieces. It was this last of many similar tragedies in eastern Lake Ontario waters that motivated the masters and owners of vessels on the lake to petition the legislature of Upper Canada to have lighthouses erected in the approaches to Kingston. At that time, there was only 1 lighthouse on the Canadian side, that was at York. In the 1820s, the United States government had built a small number of lighthouses on the US side. And by the end of the 1820s, with the Erie Canal and the Oswego Canal in operation, and the Welland Canal and Rideau Canal about to open, shipping on the Great Lakes was at an all-time high. So between 1828 and 1833, 3 new lighthouses were built in eastern Lake Ontario waters. These were the first important links in the chain of lighthouses that would eventually stretch from Kingston to Presqu'Île and provide safety and convenience to navigation through the graveyard of Lake Ontario. Among these was the 9 Mile Point Lighthouse. But all 3 of these lighthouses had a lot in common. Functionally, they were all built as lake lights. Whether mariners were sailing the open lake from Kingston or Oswego or the Genesee or York or the Welland Canal, when they saw one of these lights, they were able to avoid any dangerous shoals and confirm their course and position day or night. Until the construction of other lighthouses in Kingston's vicinity, the 9 Mile Point Lighthouse also served as Kingston's outer harbor light to guide ships into port and to the southern terminus of the Rideau Canal. While many people were involved in the construction of these first lake lights, 3 prominent Kingston names in particular are associated with all 3. John Macaulay, one of the lighthouse commissioners, Thomas Rogers, the architect and superintendent of works, and Robert Matthews, the principal stonemason. John Macaulay was the eldest son of a Loyalist refugee who had been a successful shopkeeper and freight forwarder in Kingston, and John followed in his father's footsteps in the retail and freight business in partnership with his uncle, John Kirby. In addition, at the age of 27, John Macaulay became the publisher of the Kingston Chronicle newspaper. At that time, it was one of the largest circulation newspapers in Upper Canada, and its views were commonly pro-government. As a result, Macaulay gained numerous government appointments, including president of the Commission of Internal Navigation, postmaster of Kingston, and a commissioner for the new provincial penitentiary. Among his many occupations, John Macaulay was also a warden of St. George's Church in Kingston. In 1825, when it was decided to replace the original wooden church with a new stone structure, the church wardens hired local architect Thomas Rogers to design the new St. George's and to oversee its construction. And Robert Matthews was one of the stonemasons hired to build the church. The three lighthouses were also very similar in design. All of them were built of locally quarried limestone. Some of it came from Wapoos Island in Prince Edward County. Some of it came from Millhaven, and you can still see the quarry there where the stone was cut. And some of it came from quarries at Hatter's Bay, which we know today as Portsmouth Olympic Harbor. All the towers were cylindrical, tapering slightly to the top where there was stone corbelling, which flared out to form a broad platform for the lantern. Both the Falstocks Island Lighthouse and the Point Peter Lighthouse were 62 feet tall. The 9 Mile Point Light Tower was 40 feet tall. An arched doorway with a fanlight transom gave access to the interior spiral staircase that was lit by a series of simple rectangular windows with cut stone sills. The staircase ended in a watchroom, which was no more than a landing with a brick vaulted ceiling designed to support the lantern platform. A small supply of oil was kept here to refuel the lamps if they ran dry during the night. Access to the lantern itself was by a ladder through a hatch in the ceiling. Now, the lanterns themselves were works of engineering excellence. The Falstocks lantern had been built by a blacksmith in Brownville, New York, near Watertown. The lanterns for the lighthouses at Point Peter and 9 Mile Point were built by Charles Masson, a Kingston blacksmith. These early lanterns were essentially large octagonal cages. Each side of the octagon was crisscrossed with astragals into which were fitted double thick panes of window glass. The whole thing was crowned with a substantial copper dome into which was fitted a chimney to allow hot air and smoke from the oil lamps to escape. The lanterns of all three lighthouses contained an array of Lewis lamps, which had been imported from Captain Winslow Lewis's shop in Boston, Massachusetts. The Lewis lamp was essentially a cheap knockoff of a lighthouse lamp system that had been perfected in Britain and in France that consisted of an argon lamp and a parabolic reflector. Monsieur Aimé Argan was a Swiss inventor who improved the standard oil lamp in the late 18th century by using a hollow wick and a tall chimney. The result was less smoke and more illumination. When combined with spermaceti oil, that is oil from a sperm whale, it produced a very bright and almost smokeless light. Captain Lewis had placed an argon lamp in front of a parabolic reflector made of copper, lined with silver and polished to a mirror finish. Lewis also added a thick glass magnifying lens in front of the lamp in the mistaken belief that this would improve the effectiveness of the lighting system. Although the Lewis lamp was inferior to its British and French counterparts because of its poor quality components, it was far superior to previous lighting systems, and it had the twin advantages of being readily available at considerably lower cost than those sourced from across the Atlantic. As spermaceti became more expensive due to the overhunting of sperm whales, other fuels were being used in the lamps. By the 1850s, Abraham Gessner's successes in Nova Scotia with distilling oil from coal gave us kerosene. Vegetable oil was tried, as well as pinch gas, acetylene, and eventually electricity. Lamps and reflectors were gradually improved But by the beginning of the 20th century, almost all of these reflecting lights had been replaced with the superior focusing Fresnel lens system. It was the light keeper's job to tend to the light, fill the lamps with oil, trim the wicks, clean the lenses and reflectors, replace any broken panes in the lantern, and generally maintain the grounds. The first light keeper at 9 Mile Point was Thomas Sparham. He kept the light there for 22 years. Eventually, when a fog bell was installed at 9 Mile Point, well, that's the shorter pyramidal tower to the left of the lighthouse in this picture. The lightkeeper was also responsible for ringing that bell at regular intervals during foggy weather. Later, the bell was replaced with a steam foghorn. The keeper was on duty essentially 24 hours a day for the 30-plus weeks of the shipping season, catching a few hours of sleep whenever possible during the day. For this duty, Thomas Sparham was given a house to live in year-round, rent-free, but he was paid only £26, 5 shillings and 7 pence per annum. That's the equivalent roughly in purchasing power today to about $5,200, about $25 a day. Not only was the 9 Mile Point Lighthouse a key lake light needed to guide mariners through the graveyard of Lake Ontario, it was also Kingston's only light guiding ships into the harbor. That changed in 1846, the year that Kingston was incorporated as a city. That summer, the Kingston Herald reported that the city had constructed a lighthouse on the Marine Railway Pier, located at the foot of Union Street, just a few blocks from Kingston's new City Hall. This was certainly a sign of Kingston's renewed prosperity after the Depression of the early 1840s. Not waiting for the provincial government to build a lighthouse to guide ships to safety in the harbor, the newly minted city funded the construction and maintenance of the lighthouse on its own. Other towns would soon follow Kingston's example, including Belleville, Bath, and Portsmouth, which all built their own lighthouses at municipal expense. And also across the harbor on Garden Island, D.D. Calvin even built his own private lighthouse for the benefit of his own company's ships. Now, we don't know for certain what the Kingston Harbor Lighthouse looked like, but it was likely similar to the lighthouse in this picture. Although some commentators at the time thought the lighthouse should have been situated offshore, and others suggested building a lighthouse on top of the Martello Tower located in the harbor, the Shoal Tower. The only thing the city did was to expand the lighthouse by extending its height another 20 feet in 1847. The lighthouse was manned by local resident George Clark. Kingston's lighthouse was in operation for less than a decade. Eventually, the province paid the city to maintain a light in the clock tower of City Hall, and that was used as an effective aid to navigation for several decades. Now, even the tiny village of Portsmouth on the western edge of Kingston saw the advantage of funding the construction of its own lighthouse in 1880. By then, Portsmouth had become a thriving shipbuilding and freight forwarding center, boasting a deep harbor and 2 marine railways used to build and repair sailing ships and steamboats of all sizes. The lighthouse on the end of the government pier was rebuilt in 1887, but within 7 months it had been destroyed by a fierce storm. Quite a while later, it was replaced with a small lighted beacon. But let me step back a bit here. Let's go back to the 1840s. By then, a number of substantial lighthouses, including the 9 Mile Point Lighthouse, had been built to help mariners navigate this area. and the city of Kingston had built its own lighthouse in the harbor. But in between these two lighthouses, right in the middle of the main shipping lane in Kingston's outer harbor, lay a dangerous obstruction, the Snake Island Shoal. As early as 1844, the Board of Works of the Province of Canada had recommended to the provincial legislature that a lighthouse be constructed on the shoal to guide ships away from this danger. Before the lighthouse was built in 1858, dozens of ships had been damaged and stranded on the shoal, including the schooners Weather, William Cayley, William Penn, Anne Jane Brown, and the steamer Europa. Finally, in 1858, the government constructed a stone lighthouse on the shoal, complete with a keeper's dwelling attached. It has been estimated that over the following 4 decades, no fewer than 20,000 ships would have passed by this lighthouse without incident. However, the captains of schooners such as Atlantic, Frank Crawford, Canada, and several others, whose ships still went aground near the new lighthouse, would have said it should have been built further out in the channel. Well, in 1898, the Dominion Marine and Fisheries Department decided to move the lighthouse 250 meters further offshore. Over the course of the next 2 winters, they built the second Snake Island Shoal Lighthouse, which was an octagonal wooden tower 40 feet tall. The original stone lighthouse was demolished. In 1918, the lighthouse was moved again. This time, the entire building was dragged over the ice and situated on Simcoe Island's 4 Mile Point, and it was renamed appropriately the 4 Mile Point Lighthouse. But the government had not forgotten about the dangerous open lake. In 1840, they had built the Presqu'Île Point Lighthouse. This was followed in 1856 by the Scotch Bonnet Island Lighthouse, and in 1866 by the Pleasant Point Lighthouse. The last lighthouse to be built in the 19th century by the Canadian government in the area of the graveyard of Lake Ontario was the Pigeon Island Lighthouse, built in 1870. Now, I include this one in our overview of Kingston area lighthouses, not only because it was important to the growth and prosperity of the city, but you can also see it from Kingston. That is, you can see it from the second Pigeon Island Lighthouse from Lemoyne Point or from Patterson Park using a pair of binoculars. It's quite visible. Well, Pigeon Island is really just a tiny 4-acre pile of gravel, 3.5 nautical miles west of Wolfe Island, but it's on the direct shipping route between Kingston and Oswego, New York. The Minister of Marine and Fisheries remarked in 1870 that the importance of this light can scarcely be overestimated in guiding the mail and other steamers and lake craft into Kingston and to the entrance of the River St. Lawrence. This lighthouse was built by Roderick Cameron of Lancaster, Ontario, with a unique design, the form of a schoolhouse. Later that same year, Cameron also built an identical lighthouse at Telegraph Narrows on the Bay of Quinte. The first lightkeeper at Pigeon Island was James Eccles. During his first season keeping the light, the single kerosene lamp failed one night. It caused a passing steamer, the Spartan, to run aground. Well, Eccles lost his job over the incident, and he was replaced by William Davis, who lived on Pigeon Island with his wife and 10 children. 2 years later, tragically, Davis drowned in a boating accident, and his wife, Mary, became the chief lightkeeper on Pigeon Island. She did that job for 10 years and was succeeded in the position by her sons, Richard and John. Well, after 40 years exposed to the elements on that desolate island, the lighthouse was replaced in 1909 with a forest fire watchtower that had been modified for use as a lighthouse. Now, 112 years old, the second Pigeon Island Lighthouse is still in service. By the 1880s, a new round of lighthouse construction was put into motion by the government's announcement that a shipping route to bypass the graveyard of Lake Ontario was being planned. This was the Murray Canal, to be cut across the Isthmus of Prince Edward to connect Presqu'île Bay and the Bay of Quinte. The idea of this canal had been put forward by Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe back in 1796. Over the following decades, numerous surveys of potential canal routes had been made and tens of thousands of dollars had been spent on reports. Finally, in 1881, it was announced that the canal would finally be constructed. The first sod was turned in 1882, with a completion date targeted for 1885, but the canal was not officially opened until 1890. At that time, many more ships were able to avoid the dangerous open lake by sailing through the inside passage along the Bay of Quinte between Kingston and Presqu'île. As a result, many new lighthouses and some less elaborate light towers were constructed along this route at places like Trenton, Makatuas Island, Belleville, Deseronto, and Center Brother Island at the mouth of Collins Bay. In 1888, Canada's chief lighthouse engineer and probably one of the world's most prolific lighthouse builders, William P. Anderson, recommended that a lighthouse be constructed on Center Brother Island, saying in his report that a small light would be of benefit to the passenger steamers plying between Kingston and the Bay of Quinte, as the trade will doubtless be increased when the Murray Canal is open. When the canal was finally opened in 1890, the first 10 weeks of operation saw it used by 264 vessels, carrying a total of 101,000 tons of cargo and more than 12,000 passengers. Anderson also noted that, as no one lives on the island, a small dwelling will be required, probably cost of building $2,000. So the year that the Murray Canal opened, the Center Brother Island was built. This lighthouse was in the form of a pyramidal tower with attached keeper's dwelling. By this time, this style had become the de facto lighthouse pattern for the majority of small Canadian lighthouses that were built from coast to coast. This one was built by a local contractor, Nathaniel Leonard of Westbrook. The lantern was supplied by the Chanteloup Company of Montreal and the lamp supplied by the Chance Brothers of England. This lighthouse was very similar in design to a couple that were in Prince Edward County, the Salmon Point Lighthouse, built in 1870, and the Prince Edward Point Lighthouse, built in 1881. The first lightkeeper hired by the Department of Marine and Fisheries was Robert Filson from the town of Stella on Amherst Island. But Filson subbed out his job to an assistant, contrary to government policy. The assistant was a man named Richards, who moved his family to Center Brother Island, where they lived for a year before Filson was ordered to do the job himself, or another keeper would be found to replace him. The final group of Kingston area lighthouses that I'd like to talk about tonight are two sets of specialized lighthouses called range lights. This final phase of lighthouse construction in the Kingston area was influenced largely by one major development that occurred at the other end of Lake Ontario, that is, the enlargement of the Welland Canal. Originally opened in 1826, then upgraded in 1846, By 1882, the third Welland Canal had been opened and larger ships carrying heavier loads were able to pass from the upper lakes into Lake Ontario and onward to Kingston. These ships required deeper water, especially in the principal ports like Kingston. This chart shows the difference in the size of the locks of the new and the old Welland canals. And here are a couple of examples showing the relative scale of the kinds of ships that were able to pass through the canal before and after the upgrade. Now, dredging the shoal waters in Kingston's outer harbor to accommodate these larger vessels was an option, but it was a very expensive one, costing as much as $10,000 at the time to remove as little as 1,000 yards of bottom material. So in lieu of removing every last rock and shoal, the government decided to build range lights at a fraction of the cost. Now, range lights are specialized lighthouses that are designed to work in pairs. The lighthouses are situated to line up precisely with the deepest part of the navigable channel. The rear light is always taller and usually a different color than the front light. Captains know they are in the channel as soon as their ship is aligned such that they see one light directly above the other, and they can then sail into the harbor safely. To allow for these larger ships, a pair of range lights was erected on Berryfield Common in 1892. And they were there to help guide ships past 4 dangerous shoals in Kingston's outer harbor. Now, these range lights on Berryfield Common were the latest thing in lighthouse design and technology. In fact, they would be best described as light towers. Highly effective aids to navigation, yet inexpensive to build and easy to maintain. Like all lighthouses, though, these range lights had a lightkeeper, Alexander Milligan. Every evening, he would fill the specialized locomotive headlamps with fuel, light the wicks, and hoist the lamps to the top of the towers using a rope and pulley system. In the morning, he would haul them down again. Another planned upgrade to the Welland Canal prompted a similar arrangement in Cataraqui Bay 20 years later, when the Portsmouth range lights were erected in 1912. Again, these lights were needed because even bigger ships requiring even deeper water would be coming to Kingston, and new, safer shipping lanes had to be established. The front light was placed on Carruthers Point, and the rear light was just about at the junction of where King Street West and Front Road are right now. For these range lights, the government used a hybrid approach, a standard pyramidal tower for the front range, equipped with a Fresnel lens, and a redesigned fire watchtower as the rear range light, equipped with a parabolic reflector. A local man, Edward Graham, was hired to keep these lights. Over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, all of these lighthouses contributed to the growth of Kingston and to the prosperity of Canada. I haven't mentioned at all the dozen or so lighthouses on the upper St. Lawrence River that were also very important to Kingston. I've really only concentrated here on those lighthouses and light towers at the eastern end of Lake Ontario. And you can find out more about these aids to navigation in my book, For Want of a Lighthouse. After the First World War, very few traditional iconic lighthouses were being built on Lake Ontario, and many were deactivated and demolished. Before I end my talk tonight, let me give you a very quick update on the historic lighthouses that are still standing in the Kingston area. Unfortunately, in the Kingston area, that amounts to only 2 lighthouses. There's the second Pigeon Island Lighthouse, built in 1909. Now, it's still maintained by the Canadian Coast Guard. It currently has no heritage designation, but it is eligible to be designated as a heritage lighthouse if someone is willing to take ownership and conserve it. It would only cost you $1 to purchase it, but of course, it would cost much, much more than that to preserve it. Then there's the oldest active lighthouse on Lake Ontario, the only one of the first 3 original stone lighthouses built to guide ships through the graveyard of Lake Ontario. That is the iconic 188-year-old 9 Mile Point Lighthouse. In spite of its age, in spite of its historical significance, in spite of its substantial heritage value, this lighthouse has no effective heritage designation. The Coast Guard could at any time decide to demolish this lighthouse, just like they did with the historic towers on False Ducks Island and at Point Peter. That would be an unthinkable tragedy. Now, there was a group of cottagers, mostly Americans, who owned properties near the lighthouse, and they had applied to gain ownership of it. But just before the Canadian Coast Guard was about to hand it over to them, the federal government quashed the deal amid protests by a local Canadian group. The heritage status of the 9 Mile Point Lighthouse is now in limbo. Historically, it is the most important lighthouse on the Canadian side of the Great Lakes, and the Government of Canada must be urged to take on the responsibility of protecting and conserving this heritage structure for the sake of all Canadians. I would encourage you to write Mark Gerritsen, your local MP in Kingston, or your own local MP, wherever you are, and ask that Parks Canada take over this lighthouse from the Coast Guard so that it can be properly preserved for future generations. I would also ask that the Kingston Historical Society and the Frontenac Heritage Foundation look into how they can help facilitate the preservation of this last vestige of our national marine heritage. Let's save our heritage. Let's save our lighthouses. Thank you. Now I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Mark, it's Duncan McDowell. Thank you for a scintillating talk. We're now prepared to take questions. Some may have come in by chat. Others may be proffered by simply raising your hand or using the icon under reactions. I asked you before you asked your question to unmute so we can understand you. Thank you. Any questions now?
I
am unmuted. Okay. And then reaction.
Hello, am I on?
Jean Baxter, please go
Yes.
ahead.
I am very interested in lighthouses and very interested in this particular lighthouse because my own family history is from Pelee Island, where there is a lighthouse that seems to me to be almost the twin of the one you're talking about tonight. That is to say, it's 40 feet high and it was built about 1832. It's marvelously preserved. And but I had just one little question about it, is that historically they had a great deal of difficulty getting enough whale oil for the lighthouse. And though its light was supposed to shine, and I'm sure it did shine for 9 miles all around, there were a tremendous number of complaints that half the time it wasn't lit because there wasn't enough whale oil. I wondered if this was a problem that ever arose with 9 Mile Point Lighthouse. It may have been very common at that time.
I don't know of any specific issues with oil supply for the 9 Mile Point Lighthouse. It was generally an issue going into the middle of the 19th century for all lighthouses around the world. And that's why all these alternative fuels were developed. For a while, a lot of lighthouses were burning canola oil and other vegetable oils, but they would not give a really bright light like spermaceti. And it wasn't until after the mid-century that kerosene was readily available, which was a very, very bright light. Many lighthouses later in the century actually converted to acetylene. And anyone that's used acetylene in a cutting torch would know that it is an extremely bright light. And it was quite an effective fuel to be used. It could be generated locally with calcium carbide combining with water. So it was fairly easy to transport the components to the lighthouse and make acetylene right within the lighthouse grounds. Also, they had a lighthouse tender that was usually docked in Kingston that was used to replenish the lighthouses with the acetylene components. And at one point, unfortunately, that ship caught fire and it exploded right in Kingston Harbor. But Jean, just to specifically talk about the Pelee Island Lighthouse, yes, that is the same style of lighthouse as the ones that I have talked about here, especially 9 Mile Point.
As if it was a
and
twin.
it's quite old.
Yes, and a wonderful job has been done of restoring it. And if that could be done on Pelee Island, I'm sure it could be done here.
Well, I think with the help of local organizations, it really should be done.
I agree. Thank you.
We have a question from MDS who, if I might ask him to unmute and pose that question.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Professor Smith is in the audience. I can see him in front of me. He happens to be an authority on the subject of limestone. And I'm very interested in knowing if there is a particular kind of limestone that might be used for the construction of lighthouses. Thank you.
My take on it is I don't know.
Yes.
I know originally when the Falstocks Island Lighthouse was being constructed in 1828,
yeah,
they had hoped to use the local stone on the island. There's quite a bit of limestone, surface deposits of limestone on Falstocks Island, but it was such poor quality that they had to go to quarries on Wapoos and in Millhaven.
Mm-hmm.
But what type of limestone that is, I'll have to leave it to others.
It's a very fine,
to inform me.
yeah, it's a very fine crystalline limestone formed originally in tropical climates by lime mud. In this case, in the Kingston area, about 420 million years ago, and it weathers well if you can square it up and remove any shaly layers that are in it, and simply take the massive limestone itself, as we see with so many of the buildings around Kingston that have done that very beautifully.
Paul Van Ness, I see you have a question.
Thank you. My question concerns the lights themselves. I presume they rotate, but I wonder if they rotate with different codes as they do in the St. Lawrence River.
when the first 3 lighthouses were built, that's False Ducks, Point Peter, and 9 Mile Point, they were all fixed white lights.
Oh.
And a lot of mariners complained about that because they weren't always sure exactly where they were after a storm or after a long night's passage. Were they off of Prince Edward County? Were they somewhere in between False Ducks and Wolf Island? Or were they approaching Kingston? They didn't know because the lights all looked the same.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't until the middle of the century that they finally put a revolving light in the Point Peter lighthouse. And by the time that the Pigeon Island lighthouse was constructed, that one was purpose built with a revolving light in it. And then later, different color lights were also used. So then they had different, some lights were revolving where the light itself would move around. Some were called occulting, where there was a shade that would rotate in front of the light. And then they would also have different lighting intervals. Some would flash
Yes.
once every
Yes.
30 seconds or once every minute or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Questions?
Yes, this is Gordon Janice Gibbons. Thank you, Mark, for such an interesting presentation. We've heard you before, but not specifically on Kingston. What exactly would be required for a group such as the Kingston Historical Society or any other to preserve the 9 Mile Lighthouse?
Well,
if you had to write a plan, what would it be?
Yeah, the difficulty with preserving any lighthouse is, first of all, it has to be designated. Once the Coast Guard transfers it over to a private group or a municipality, or to the province, in fact, they could do that. They would have an undertaking that the lighthouse would be conserved. That doesn't mean it has to be restored. It doesn't mean that it would have to be revitalized in any substantial way, but it would have to be conserved so that at least it doesn't fall down, and it would be standing for a long time. There were 2 groups, local groups that had submitted proposals to the Coast Guard to take over the 9 Mile Point Lighthouse. And one of those groups, as I mentioned, had a board that was composed of a number of American property owners who lived near the lighthouse. And the other group, based largely on Wolf Island, was had tried to get the local municipality to help fund the proposal. In the end, the municipality, which was Frontenac Islands, decided to back out of it altogether. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. So it's really just a matter of having a good plan, a good proposal to be put in front of the Coast Guard that shows that your organization can fund in the long term the preservation of a very old masonry structure. And I think that's where the 9 Mile Point Lighthouse Preservation Society is at the moment. They're trying to drum up enough support to be able to do that and go back to the Coast Guard and say that they are the preferred divestee for the lighthouse. And I know there's some members of the 9 Mile Point Lighthouse Preservation Society online this evening. I see Judy Greenwood here. I don't know, maybe you'd like to comment, Judy?
Sure. When the government did the evaluation of the 2 proposals, and we were the only ones that put it in time, the others got an extension, but anyways, when they did the evaluation, and they made their decision. They came back and they said, well, the other one was better. And we said, how? Well, they didn't want to be specific about it. And they were very, very evasive. And they said, well, you know, money needs to be involved. Well, you've never asked us if we need to put up a bond or anything like that. Are the other people putting up a bond? Oh, couldn't say anything at all. So they're very, very not transparent. So we had numerous Zoom calls with them. And finally, we developed a petition and we had Mark Gerritsen submit it to Parliament. And that's really the piece that I think helped to stall it out. And then it came back that the other party had failed in one of the terms of the agreement, because at that point in time, it was virtually a done deal when I got involved in the project. And so at least it's not a done deal. It's more a level of suspended animation at this point, in that the other group doesn't get to have it, but they won't give it to us either. And we don't have access to get into it, to even develop it. And we made the point that, you know, it's an opportunity for tourism and heritage and putting up display boards for the marine. You know, it's a real wonderful opportunity, and they just are sort of stuck in limbo. So we're sort of a minor victory in stopping, or at least having them change their position of divesting it to the Americans, and that, but they won't give us full access. And Mark is right that our own township has been less than transparent in their support. At a public meeting, they'll say, oh yes, they want to have it brought back to them again. And then they won't even give us a letter of support for the next level of government. So it's difficult when Frontenac Islands won't go on the record that they'll even stand there. And we're not asking for a cent from them. It's very frustrating that, but at this point in time, we've made some progress, and Mark Gerritsen is certainly aware. And I think if people want to write letters and speak to him, it will help it move further, but at least we got a stop put in place.
Mark, let me make a follow-on question here and perhaps an observation after that. To what degree is that old Canadian bugbear of federal-provincial relations a theme in all of this? Now, the BNA Act in 1867 gave navigable waters, as we all know, to the feds. Was that interpassage federal, or was it, because it was so enclosed, was it a provincial authority? I mean, the kind of frictions we've just heard about of getting consensus on saving these is a quintessential Canadian problem. Do you go to Ottawa, do you go to Toronto, or do you go to City Hall? Is this a theme here?
I understand what you're saying, Duncan, but I really do not think it is a theme here. It's clearly, the lighthouse is clearly owned by the Coast Guard, or, you know, they are the custodians of the lighthouse, the Canadian Coast Guard being a federal agency. And in my opinion, the real custodians should be Parks Canada, to preserve this lighthouse and conserve it properly, perhaps open it up to the general public at some point. It is the last remaining lighthouse of its kind on Lake Ontario. And, you know, unfortunately, Parks Canada is not in the business of going around and looking for properties to preserve and take under their wing. They don't do that. They sit back and they'll do a good job at manning and conserving the properties they have, but they will simply sit back and wait for their ministers to say, okay, you go out and you're now responsible for this new property or that new property. And so I think it's up to us as a group, as a community, to put pressure on our local MPs, on the government, to get them to say that to Parks Canada, to say the 9 Mile Point Lighthouse is going to be preserved. It's going to be within Parks Canada's mandate, and so go to it.
I said I might make an observation. I don't write about Ontario, but I do write a lot about the Bermuda colony in the mid-Atlantic, which is surrounded by a vicious reef, which has snagged ships for centuries. The same time you've been talking, they built their first lighthouses at Gibbs Hill and St. David's. What's ironic there is there was a great deal of public pushback because Bermudians saw a good wreck as a source of livelihood, and a lighthood was unfair. So if you read the assembly debates, you'll see people voting against the expenditure. It was made. Lighthouse is very similar to what you've described. What's interesting, I think, in terms of their preservation, because in this age of GPS and radar, lighthouses are not as important as they used to be. They're still important, but they're not going to be the central thing. Those two lighthouses in Bermuda are now tourist attractions. If you look at any of the brochures or the photography of Bermuda, Gibbs Hill Lighthouse is central to it. The one advantage they have is they are shore-based and can be reached by tourists on shore. But it's tourism that has really saved them. The navigation is still important, but they are tourist attractions. And one of the problems I think you face is these are largely inaccessible. And 9 Mile Point, of course, you'd need a boat to get out there, a tourist thing. But if you can connect it to tourism, you have livelihood there. You have longevity there, I think.
Yeah.
Actually, 9 Mile Point is connected by a cable ferry at this point in time, and a brand new ferry has already been ordered for Simcoe Island. So that's part of Frontenac Island's township, and it is accessible, and that just not in the dead of winter. Usually around January 1st, when the ice is too thick, it stops, and that for 3 months. But that's not your high tourist season. But I look at that and think, even the windsurfers that come over from Kingston, wouldn't it be wonderful to windsurf over and take a respite out at 9 Mile Point? Like, the potential is huge. We did contact the provincial government and their tourism, and we made that case. We said, this is heritage that is Ontario heritage, but also a potential of tourism. And again, part of the challenge is our own Frontenac Township is so short-sighted that all they love to say is, well, there could be liability. Well, then that's what insurance is all about. But it has been an uphill battle because you cannot get support locally from that particular group of councillors. And our council is even made up between Howe Island and ourselves, and that Wolf and Simcoe. So the Howe Islanders look at it, well, we don't want to have anything to do with it. Oh, Jesus, Murphy. Can you not think long term? This could be a huge draw in the summertime and real potential there.
Judy, I think you've probably visited the Tibbetts Point Lighthouse over in Cape Vincent.
Yep.
Which we visit it every year. It's got a very strong group of local volunteers who take tours, run a gift shop. But again, it is connected to the land. You could drive there in your car, but it is a good example of the tourist potential of a lighthouse.
Yeah, even a historic teaching tool, and that it not only has to do with the Marine, it has to do with the French Indian Wars, and that it has to do with fur trade. It has to do, it's on Gil Foray, and that who was clerk of LaSalle. Like, there's so much history rich there, and there's enough land still that you could put up wonderful plaques, put up a couple of picnics. We had the business plan, and it was a good business plan, and it was so frustrating that they came back and said the other one's better. Well, A, it didn't even get in on time. B, tell us how it's better. Well, they couldn't tell us that. So, they were being very, very opaque. It truly was the petition, I believe, that stopped the movement that just was already signed off by Wilkinson from the Coast Guard. And then he got moved to Environment, I believe, and that he was supposed to be the next signature, but Catherine McKinnon was the one that actually held it up for us at the start.
Vincent, do you have a question?
I have a comment for Judy. Based on something that Duncan had been talking about, I really think that it does belong in the bailiwick of Parks Canada. And the Kingston Historical Society for 95 years has had an agreement with Parks Canada where we operate the museum in the Murney Tower here in Kingston. So the idea is we pay $1 a year to run this museum. I still don't know why they're not paying us $1 a year, but that's beside the point. They preserve it. They own it. There's no question about it. We have a 5-year ongoing, every 5 years we sign a new contract. We signed one last year. So I think Duncan is onto something there and you're onto something, but it could be that, obviously because of the BNA Act and that, it does belong to the federal government. It's in their purview. And I think that would be the angle to go to. And tourism, sure, that comes into it. All that stuff comes into it. But you would have, we fundraise, for example, to operate the inside of the museum or the inside of the tower as a museum. But it is owned and preserved. And that's the key, is who is going to preserve this? It's preserved by Parks Canada.
Yeah, I believe in our petition, we asked the Parks Canada to become involved.
Okay.
And I actually had a family member who was working with Parks Canada at the time who was telling me about the major cut in funding that Parks Canada had been delved out in the previous budget. So it was actually at that point a no-go, but truly it should be organized by Parks Canada, and that would be the most logical.
And then a local group, like
Yeah.
in our case, the Historical Society, which has been around for 120 some years, would maintain, do the local fundraising, all the stuff that you
Yeah.
folks have been doing. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems so straightforward
Mhm.
that it needs to be done, and that
Mhm.
and it's political will and the strength to get it pushed through all the way. So as I said, if you can lobby with Mark Gertson, great. The Wolf Island Historical Society, and we've all been members and lifetime members, so we're in league with them and everything else. But it's just we have the council on this island not being supportive, so it just is a bit of a lead weight around the proposal, because the first thing they say is, well, does the council support this? No, it doesn't. And what can I say?
You go above them. It's a federal issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they all look to, they don't want to be overstepping a council too. It's very problematic. So we'll work to replace them.
Okay.
Okay.
Well,
I see we have a question from Michelle.
Yes, we have a couple. I'm just looking at the queue of questions. I have 3 or 4 actually. 2 are in the audience. I have Sandra, who's had her virtual hand raised for a while there.
Sandra, please go ahead. Unmute before you talk.
Okay. I was just interested in the social history of the lighthouses. Like the lighthouse keeper, did his family live with him in the lighthouse? And have you, Mark, had a chance to ever talk to any of the descendants of people who may have lived in those lighthouses?
Yes, often the lighthouse keeper would have his family with him either in the dwelling that was attached to the lighthouse or in a nearby dwelling, might have been just a few yards away. Lighthouses in Canada, for the most part, it's a bit of a misnomer. If you look at the enormous lighthouses built by, say, the Stevensons in Britain, those were absolutely enormous towers, and inside them there were several apartments that people could live. In the light towers in Canada, they were typically a lot smaller. Nobody would actually live inside the tower itself. They would live either in an attached keeper's dwelling or a detached keeper's dwelling. But yes, often they would have their family with them. On Pigeon Island, Davis had his 10 children with him.
Yeah, I remember.
Mary, and they farmed, the 4 acres that they had there. They farmed it to their best of their ability to supplement their food and their income. And they also did a lot of fishing to supplement their income. That was quite common at most lighthouses. The big exception was the Center Brother Island Lighthouse, where there was a very small dwelling there. It was good for 1 or 2 people. But when the lighthouse keeper finally said, well, look, I want to bring my family over, and live there, but it's just too small. How about if we make it bigger? The chief engineer of the Lighthouse department said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. When he ran it up to the deputy minister level, the deputy minister shot the idea down, said, no, we're not going to pay for that. So too bad. So he couldn't have his family there with him. The only Lighthouse families that I've talked to were the McConnells, who used to keep the light at Main Dock and also at False Ducks. I've talked to some of their offspring, but because there are no more light keepers in any of the lighthouses anymore in Ontario, and only a few on the East Coast and the West Coast, there's really no one to talk to anymore. All of the light keepers are gone. Most of their families are gone. And so it's, it's another piece of our heritage that is passing, and hopefully the built heritage will be the only piece left that we can preserve.
Hi, sorry, it's Judy again, but Brenda McDonald is watching this call right now, and her father was the lighthouse keeper at 9 Mile Point.
Oh.
Brenda. Speak up, Brenda.
You have to unmute, Brenda.
I'm working on it.
Yeah.
My dad did not have a full-time light keeper job, but he did do some fill-in when the light keeper needed some time off. So I remember that would have been sometime in the 1960s. And there are two descendants of some of the last lighthouse keepers at 9 Mile Point that live on Wolf Island. And so they might be somebody Mark could talk to too, because I think they talked about painting the tower and stuff like that. So maybe we can send Mark that info.
Thank you.
We have, sorry.
I'm reminded of the dreadful joke they tell on the Kingston tour boats of the woman who had just been proposed to by a lighthouse keeper, inquiring about what her marital duties would be. And he said, oh dear, only a little light housekeeping. Apocryphal, no doubt. We have time for a few more questions, I think.
Perfect. I have John Chown on the list here.
Yeah.
John, would you please unmute? Thank you.
I have. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay. I want to shift to a different lighthouse just for a moment, but I am sincerely interested in 9 Mile Point, so let's get back to it as soon as I'm done. But the Salmon Point Lighthouse is on a tract of land that I think has been privately owned for quite a while, and it has been transferred from owner to owner. Do you know who owns that land now?
Yeah, the Salmon Point Lighthouse and all the land around it is owned by a numbered company. The numbered company is owned by the Thompson family in Toronto.
Okay.
And
yes, I wondered about that, and thank you for that answer. So back to 9 Mile Point.
Thank you.
Are there other questions?
I have a couple questions that came in over the chat that I'll read out.
Could I just interrupt for a second on the Thompson Lighthouse situation?
Go ahead, Gord.
I think, in fact, I think Mark was the chair of the Prince Edward County Heritage Association at the time, our Prince Edward County Heritage Advisory Committee. If he wasn't, it was the next chair. That we made many attempts to try to get that lighthouse designated, and they would not acknowledge anything. And we did registered letters every possible way other than hiring a lawyer, and they were totally mute on the whole subject. But that was a goal of the Heritage Committee of Prince Edward County for a whole term, I think. At least, yeah. Probably started with Mark and ended up with my wife Janice, his efforts.
I remember it well, Gord. I remember it well.
Ah, there you go.
Hey, Ryan.
Michelle, you have a question, more questions?
Yes, I have a couple to read out. First one is, why were so many lighthouses not preserved as historical sites?
A lot of lighthouses, especially back, and I'm thinking back in the 60s, specifically when the like the 9 Mile Point, not 9 Mile Point, but Point Peter and Falstocks Island were deactivated, and they were actually offered up to organizations like Parks Canada, and Parks Canada at the time, they just said, no, we're not interested. Those are not historic. We just don't want them. And was that a financial thing, or were they really just ignorant at the time? I don't know. But frankly, a lot of the lighthouses were looked at simply as tools that had a value at the time. And especially once the larger ships started sailing the lakes, any of these smaller lighthouses that were in smaller harbors, especially along the Bay of Quinte, those lighthouses were no longer used. Most of them were just wooden structures, and they just rotted away. The one you see behind me here in my picture, that's a prime example. That's the Telegraph Island Lighthouse. It's identical to the first Pigeon Island Lighthouse, built by the same person. That lighthouse just crumbled away after ships no longer were sailing on the Bay of Quinte. There was no reason to have it there. And instead, what they did was the Coast Guard just put either a skeleton tower with a beacon on top, or a buoy very close by. And those are a lot easier to maintain, a lot cheaper to manufacture than these enormous lighthouses. So unfortunately, a lot of the lighthouses just fell into oblivion. And we have the chance now to save this one lighthouse, if not two, if somebody really wants to step up and try to save the Pigeon Island Lighthouse as well. It's quite a unique structure.
Michelle, let's take one more question
more?
if you pass it along.
Let's go here.
My question?
Sorry. I'll just read this one out. So, any updates on the extant lighthouses in Prince Edward County? Some are in private ownership.
Yeah, the one that is in private ownership, we mentioned already, is Salmon Point Lighthouse. There are two other historic lighthouses in Prince Edward County that have been designated by the federal government. There's the Scotch Bonnet Island Lighthouse. If anyone has seen that, it's really just a ruin on Scotch Bonnet Island, the far southwestern point of Prince Edward County. And there's the Prince Edward Point Lighthouse, which both of those lighthouses, by the way, are only being preserved, and they've only been designated under the Heritage Lighthouse Protection Act because they were already property of the federal government, and they had no plans to divest them. In other words, they were not being controlled by the Coast Guard. So anything that was controlled by the Coast Guard, like 9 Mile Point or Pigeon Island, they had a mandate to divest those properties before they could be designated as heritage properties and conserved. The two in Prince Edward County, Scotch Bonnet and Point Traverse, Prince Edward Point, were already part of the federal government, but not the Coast Guard. So they were almost automatically just rubber stamped as heritage lighthouses. There are three others though. There's a new Falstocks Island Lighthouse, a concrete structure, a new Point Peter Lighthouse, and a 1914 structure on Main Duck Island, the tallest lighthouse on Lake Ontario, the Main Duck Island Lighthouse. Beautiful, beautiful, iconic structure. Those three are still the property of the Coast Guard. They too have not been designated, and we are still struggling to get the Coast Guard to divest them to a local group so that they can be conserved.
Mark, I'm going to give you a few minutes rest here, and I'm going to call on Barry Keefe of our council to express our thanks to you this evening. Barry. Please unmute, Barry.
There I go. Well, Mark, it was great to have this discussion. As Duncan suggested at the beginning, you have shed a lot of light on this topic. We're sorry to see that so many have disappeared, and obviously the discussion has led to some really good ideas and perhaps some action on the last one. I'm intrigued a little bit that someone who comes from landlocked University of Western Ontario should be so passionate about things that are out of the water, on the water's edge. But I'm also a history grad from Western, and I get it. I understand how this part of the country is so intriguing. So happy to be here. And what we have decided at the Kingston Historic Society is to make a donation to your foundation for preservation of lighthouses, and I hope it'll help in some small way. So thank you very much on behalf of the 67 of us who have shown up to listen to this tonight.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you so much for the donation. It'll be put to good use.
Mark.
And go Mustangs.
Mark, again, thank you. Wrap up the evening by saying this lecture has been recorded, will be available in the very near future as a YouTube video. If you wish to transmit it to anyone or watch it again yourself, please just get in contact with Paul Van Ness of our society through our website, and he will give you the link to it to send on to other people. Let me remind you that our next lecture in the series is not until Wednesday, April the 17th, at which time Dr. Tabitha Renault will be here, a recent Queen's PhD graduate, who will talk about the question of how did the indigenous people communicate with the first white explorers. We assume they all talk English, but of course they didn't. So what is the communication problem? What is the challenge historically of understanding what they understood from the white arrivals and what the whites thought of the indigenous? So I've heard this talk before. It's an excellent talk. She's a wonderful speaker. So that is on April the 17th at 7 o'clock. Zoom information will be sent out shortly before the lecture, just as it has for this one. So without further ado, let me thank you all for coming and thank our speaker again. And we will turn our thoughts to lighthouses as individuals and as a society. So good night, everyone, and thank you.